Ministers, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Iiss Shangri-La Dialogue, the 18th Asia Security Summit. We have this year over 600 full delegates from some 40 countries, with a wider array of full government ministers than ever before. At the outset, let me thank our host government, Singapore, for supporting the Iiss when we conceived this summit, brought it into being, nurtured it through its early years, and now as it has been ushered happily into full adulthood. Allow me also to thank all of our lead, principal, and main sponsors whose additional support for this summit helps to ensure its unique qualities on which the Iiss seeks to build every year. Opening this summit gives me an opportunity briefly to comment on how the Iiss research program has evolved over the past year to provide policymakers, corporate leaders, and the expert community with the data and analysis they need to make intelligent decisions. European defense and security planners have long been challenged by the United States to spend more on defense, and in the last year there have been more calls by political leaders on the continent to achieve European strategic autonomy. Despite reams of papers being written on European defense, mostly on its prospective institutional arrangements, no one had actually asked the question, what would European strategic autonomy actually cost? In a study we released last month, the Iiss asked this question, and having developed scenarios and using our proprietary Military Balance Plus tool, we measured European defense capability gaps and the price of closing them. Our headline conclusion: the Iiss assesses that European NATO members would have to invest between US $288 billion and US $357 billion to fill the capability gaps needed to defend European NATO territory against a state-level military attack. These investments would establish a NATO-Europe force level that would likely allow it to prevail in a limited regional war in Europe against a peer adversary. And so this Iiss study provides fully costed analysis to support an intelligent debate on European defense. In the Middle East, there has been heightened concern around the activities of Iranian proxies and partners operating in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, the Gulf states, Afghanistan, and beyond. No one, however, has published a proper taxonomy of the various influence networks operated by Iran, an analysis of their command and control mechanisms, how they achieve their initial purchase in foreign societies, the nature of the strategic directions given, or the capacities of different types of proxy actors linked to Iran for independent action. Without such a refined analysis, it is unlikely that sound policies can be developed. It is that independent assessment that the Iiss is seeking to provide, and we will publish later this year a strategic dossier on Iran's influence networks. Not a day passes now without people talking about cybersecurity risk and the increasing proclivity of states to blend cyber capacity into their military operations. Yet again, no serious effort has been made to measure cyber power, and the metrics have not been properly defined. The Iiss is developing a methodology prudently to measure cyber power, not only to assess where countries stand, but also to determine what a country might need to do in order to move from, for example, a Tier 3 to a Tier 2 status, or even to aspire to be a cyber power of the first rank. We will deploy that methodology to develop national assessments later this year and fully apply it in our Iiss military balance book next year. Here in the Asia Pacific, out of our excellent international office based in Singapore. The IISS is generating work of direct relevance to all the participants here. We're examining the impact of changing domestic politics in Southeast Asian countries on regional and international foreign policies. The IISS is conducting a major assessment of the geoeconomic, trade, investment, energy, and geopolitical implications of the Belt and Road Initiative, and is also assessing the detail of the digital Silk Road, one strand of the BRI that has elicited less strategic analysis than has the traditional infrastructure elements. Our annual regional security assessment, released for this 18th Iiss Shangri-La Dialogue, covers a host of other issues, including those that will be debated here, as like the nuclear challenge posed by North Korea. We are delighted that our work on East Asia will soon be strengthened in London. As a result of a major multi-million-dollar donation from the government of Japan, we shall establish a Japan chair in London and appoint a senior fellow for Japanese security studies who will develop a program on Japanese security and play a large role in our Asia-Pacific activities. This Shangri-La Dialogue takes place at a time of great strategic flux. We are proud of the high-level attendance, and I want in particular to note the participation this year of China's State Councillor and Defense Minister General Wei Fenghe, accompanied by a strong delegation from the People's Liberation Army. It is also splendid to welcome the British Defense Minister 1 month after her appointment, and the Australian Defense Minister 2 days after hers. As is often the case, many defense ministers here will be meeting each other for the first time. When 2 decades ago the IISS decided to launch a defense summit in Asia that would uniquely bring together defense ministers who otherwise would have no easy means of convening themselves, we chose Singapore because of its well-established reputation for diplomatic entrepreneurship. We knew that here in Singapore, this then novel idea would have a chance to flourish. Prime Minister Hsien Loong, during his 15-year tenure as leader of this city-state, has strengthened its global reputation for strategic thinking. His analysis of regional and global issues has long been sought by outsiders keen to appreciate the nuances and impact of geoeconomic and geopolitical developments in the region and beyond. In his previous addresses to the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue in 2006 and 2015, he provided a masterly survey of Asia-Pacific issues and helped to set the dialogue agenda. The current fragilities in the international system and the regularly intemperate nature of diplomatic exchanges again demands a cool-headed approach. Against that background, it is an honor for the IISS and a great personal pleasure for me in this bicentennial year of celebrations in Singapore to invite the Prime Minister of Singapore to develop the keynote address at this 18th Shangri-La Dialogue. Prime Minister, this podium is yours.
Dr. John Chipman, Director General and Chief Executive of the IISS, Your Excellencies, Ministers, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening to all of you, and welcome to Singapore and to the 18th edition of the Shangri-La Dialogue. Our world is at a turning point. Globalization is under siege. Tensions between the US and China are growing. Like everyone else, we in Singapore are anxious. We wonder what the future holds and how countries can collectively find a way forward to maintain peace and prosperity in the world. What can the history of Southeast Asia tell us about avoiding upheavals and disasters in our path ahead. This year, as you've heard from John, Singapore is commemorating our bicentennial. 200 years ago, Stamford Raffles, an Englishman, landed in Singapore and founded a trading post here. The Dutch had already colonized the Dutch East Indies, so the British were actually latecomers to Southeast Asia. Raffles was Lieutenant Governor of Bencoolen on the west coast of Sumatra. He saw the trade potential of the region and decided to look for a new outpost for the British East India Company along the Straits of Malacca. He chose Singapore, and that changed our destiny. The Dutch protested Raffles' action furiously, but in vain. To preserve their monopoly, the Dutch had either prohibited foreign ships from operating in their ports or imposed high tariffs. Raffles took a different approach. He set up Singapore as a free port. Trade boomed and the settlement prospered. The more open approach of the British delivered superior results. Over the next century, Southeast Asia was divided between British, Dutch, Spanish, French, and later the Americans. Their rivalry was intense. No single colonial power dominated the region. In the 20th century, the interests of the great powers continued to intersect in Southeast Asia. In 1941, Imperial Japan invaded Indochina. The US retaliated with an oil embargo on Japan. And this was the immediate trigger for the Pacific War. On the same day that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, they also attacked Malaya and Singapore. There followed for us, in Singapore, the Japanese occupation. 3 years and 8 months of oppression, fear, and misery. During the Cold War, Southeast Asia was again on the front line. The region was split between communist and non-communist states. Vietnam became the battlefield for a proxy war between the two camps. Meanwhile, China supported communist insurgencies and promoted armed revolution in the non-communist countries, including Malaysia and Singapore. This was the backdrop when the 5 non-communist countries in Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, Philippines, Thailand, came together to form ASEAN in 1967. It was a remarkable act of statesmanship. Several of the partners had a recent history of conflict with one another, and the wounds had yet to heal fully. But with ASEAN, the 5 countries eschewed conflict and took the path of dialogue, cooperation, and friendship. We integrated into the world economy, linked up with the advanced countries, and thrived. Meanwhile, the communist countries in Indochina were held back for decades by successive wars and the rigidity of their command economies. After the Cold War ended, the US became the sole superpower. Southeast Asia entered a new phase. The Indo-Chinese Wars finally ended, and the Indo-Chinese communist countries opened up. Earlier, Vietnam had invaded Cambodia, thus posing a serious threat to its non-communist neighbors. But now Vietnam joined ASEAN, together with Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar. It was a case of beating swords into plowshares. Over the next decades, Southeast Asia benefited from a favorable external environment. The US was a dominant power in the Asia-Pacific and a stabilizing security presence. International trade was expanding rapidly. Trade barriers came down, often led by the United States. The ASEAN economies prospered through export-led growth and foreign investments. International frameworks like the WTO and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, established rules, managed conflict, balanced competing interests, and fostered cooperation between countries big and small. Initially, China only played a minor economic role, but as its economy took off, it became a growing partner of the ASEAN countries and a major participant in regional affairs. I recount this history to show that Southeast Asia is no stranger to the great game of nations, and to offer some historical perspective on the current strategic situation. The US-China bilateral relationship is the most important in the world today. How the two work out their tensions and frictions will define the international environment for decades to come. The relationship has already altered significantly. China has totally changed since it started opening up 40 years ago. Its GDP per capita has grown by more than 25 times in real terms. China is now the second largest economy in the world. On many counts, China's growth is a tremendous boon, both to itself and to the world. China has substantially transformed its backward, centrally planned economy into a middle-income, market-driven one, even though it's still far from being a full market economy. More than 850 million Chinese people have been lifted out of poverty, an achievement unprecedented in human history. China's development and success has benefited the world too. China has become a massive production and manufacturing base, lowering costs for the world's producers, first for labor-intensive goods, and now increasingly for high-tech and technology-intensive production. It's also a huge market, importing everything from commodities and electronic components to aircraft and fine wines. On the consumer side, billions of people worldwide buy all manner of products, from Barbie dolls and basketballs to drones and mobile phones, made in China, though often incorporating foreign components and technology. Imagine, conversely, had China remained closed and underdeveloped. A failing China would have exported many problems to the world, quite possibly still including armed revolution. Its huge population would have been resentful and restless at being left behind by other countries. A generation ago, when China was still poor, Deng Xiaoping was asked by US President Jimmy Carter to allow more people to emigrate. He answered, "Well, Mr. President, how many Chinese nationals do you want? 10 million? 20 million? 30 million? China's success has enabled the world to avoid this disastrous outcome. At the same time, China's growth has shifted the strategic balance and the economic center of gravity of the world, and the shift continues. Both China and the rest of the world have to adapt to this new reality. China has to recognize that it's in a totally new situation, created by its own success. It can no longer expect to be treated in the same way as in the past, when it was much smaller and weaker. China may still be decades away from becoming a fully developed, advanced country, but it cannot wait decades before taking on larger responsibilities. Having gained much from the international system, China now has a substantial stake in upholding it and making it work for the global community. Chinese leaders have spoken up strongly in support of globalization and a rules-based international order. China must now convince other countries through its actions that it does not take a transactional and mercantilist approach, but rather an enlightened and inclusive view of its long-term interests. For example, when China joined the WTO in 2001, 18 years ago, its merchandise trade accounted for only 4% of world trade. Since then, China's share has almost tripled to 11.8%. This is why the trade arrangements and concessions that China negotiated when it joined WTO are no longer politically wearable for other countries. It is in China's own interest to prevent the international framework of trade from breaking down and to implement timely changes that bring about greater reciprocity and parity with its trading partners and that are more consistent with present-day China's more advanced state of development. Similarly, in security, now that China is a major power with the second largest defense budget in the world, its words and actions are seen differently. To protect its territories and trade routes, it is natural that China would want to develop modern and capable armed forces and aspire to become not just a continental power, but also a maritime power. At the same time, to grow its international influence beyond hard power, military strength, China needs to wield this strength with restraint and legitimacy. Frictions will arise between China and other countries from time to time. The overlapping maritime claims in the South China Sea are one example. China should resolve these disputes peacefully in accordance with international law, including the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It should do so through diplomacy and compromise rather than force or the threat of force, while giving weight to the core interests and rights of other countries. Then, over time, it will build its reputation as a responsible and benevolent power that need not be feared. Instead, China will be respected as a power that can be relied on to support a stable and peaceful region. In the long term, this will allow China to continue to benefit from a conducive and friendly international environment and enhance its influence and standing in the world. The rest of the world, too, has to adjust to a larger role for China. Countries have to accept that China will continue to grow and strengthen, and that it is neither possible nor wise for them to prevent this from happening. China will have its own legitimate interests and ambitions, including to develop indigenously advanced technologies like infocomms and artificial intelligence. As a major stakeholder in the international system, China should be encouraged to play commensurate and constructive roles in supranational institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and the WTO. If China cannot do so, it will create its own alternatives. The United States, being the preeminent power, has the most difficult adjustment to make. But however difficult the task, it is well worth the US forging a new understanding that will integrate China's aspirations within the current system of rules and norms. New international rules need to be made in many areas, including trade and intellectual property, cybersecurity, and social media. China will expect a say in this process because it sees the present rules as having been created in the past without its participation. And this is an entirely reasonable expectation. The bottom line is that the US and China need to work together, and with other countries too, to bring the global system up to date and to not upend the system. To succeed in this, each must understand the other's point of view and reconcile the other's interests. Meanwhile, stresses and strains have built up between the two over multiple issues, including cyber espionage, 5G technology, freedom of navigation, human rights, and especially trade, where the two countries have reached an impasse. If both sides treat their trade dispute purely on its own merits, I have no doubt that trade negotiators who are highly competent will be able to resolve it. But if either side uses trade rules to keep the other down, or one side comes to the conclusion that the other is trying to do this, then the dispute will not be resolved and the consequences will be far graver than a loss of GDP. The broader bilateral relationship will be contaminated. Other areas will inevitably be affected, including investments, technology, and people-to-people relations. Every action taken by one side will be seen as a direct challenge to the other and will elicit a counteraction. We will all be headed for a more divided and troubled world. Worryingly, this is starting to happen. Attitudes on both sides have been hardening. The US National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy documents describe China as a revisionist power and America's strategic competitor. The recent presidential executive order on securing the information and communications technology and services supply chain states that it is aimed at, quotes, foreign adversaries. It stopped just short of naming any particular country, but it made quite clear what actions the US intends to take. There's a growing bipartisan consensus in the US that China has taken advantage of the US for far too long, that China has overtaken or will soon overtake the US in areas of advanced technology, such as artificial intelligence and some aspects of military technology, through underhand means. That instead of opening up and becoming more like the US, China has regressed in terms of political openness and hence represents a challenge to American values and leadership. Americans now talk openly of containing China, and to do so soon before it is too late, the way they used to talk about the USSR and the Soviet bloc. This negative view of China has permeated the US establishment. It's not confined to the White House or the administration, but is shared widely by Congress, the military, the media, academics, and NGOs too. Those inclined to a more positive view of China have been marginalized. Even US business sentiment towards China has soured. American businesses used to be the strongest supporters of China because they benefited directly from China's growth and economic opportunities. They had strongly advocated China's accession to the WTO. When protectionist or nativist sentiments built up in the US, they were a balancing voice that counseled good relations with China. Now, that goodwill has all but evaporated. US businesses feel let down that China has not adjusted its policies on trade and investments, and in fact systematically disadvantages foreign businesses operating in China while Chinese businesses operate uninhibited in the US. They want greater access to the China market and not just to use China for their global supply chains. This loss of goodwill on the part of an important constituency is a serious problem for China, which the Chinese, I think, have not fully appreciated or dealt with. In China, views are hardening too. There are those who see the US as trying to thwart China's legitimate ambitions, convinced that no matter what they do or concede on individual issues, the US will never be satisfied. They are alarmed by talk of a clash of civilizations between the US and China. They reject what they see as efforts by the US to impose its political system and political values on China. This is coupled with a strong vein of nationalistic fervor. Chinese television is rebroadcasting old movies of the Korean War, which in Chinese is known as 抗美援朝战争, which means the war to resist America and assist North Korea. There's even a US trade war song circulating on the internet based on the theme music from a popular 1960s war movie about fighting the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War. Hardly anyone in China, whether in government, academia, or the media, can be found who is prepared to speak up for a more positive and benign interpretation of the US intent. The fundamental problem between the US and China is a mutual lack of strategic trust. This bodes ill for any compromise or peaceful accommodation. But to go down the present path would be a serious mistake on both sides. There is no strategic inevitability about a US-China face-off. But at the same time, if such a face-off does happen, it will be nothing like the Cold War. First, there is no irreconcilable ideological divide between the US and China. China may be communist in political structure, but it has adopted market principles in many areas. The Soviets sought to overturn the world order, but China has benefited from and by and large worked within the framework of existing multilateral institutions. During the Cold War, the Communist bloc sought to export communism to the world. But China today is not attempting to turn other countries communist. Indeed, it's often criticized for being too willing to do business with countries and leaders regardless of their reputation or standing, citing non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries. Second, China has extensive economic and trade links with the rest of the world. It is a major node in the world economy, unlike the USSR, whose economic links outside the Soviet bloc were negligible. In fact, all of the US's allies in Japan, in Asia, including Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Thailand, Australia, as well as many of its friends and partners, including Singapore, have China as their largest trading partner. They are all allies of the United States, friends of the United States, but their largest trading partner is China. They all hope that the US and China will resolve their differences. They want to be friends with both, to nurture security and economic ties with the US as they grow their business links with China. In a new Cold War, there can be no clear division between friend and foe. Nor is it possible to create a NATO or Warsaw Pact equivalent with a hard line drawn through Asia or drawn down the middle of the Pacific Ocean. On the other hand, if there is indeed a conflict between the US and China, where will it end? The Cold War ended with a total collapse of the sclerotic planned economies of the Soviet Union and the Eastern European countries, under the pressure of enormous defense spending, trying to match SDI, Star Wars. Even then, it took 40 years. It's highly improbable that the vigorous Chinese economy will collapse in the same way. China cannot take down the US either. The US is still by far the strongest country in the world. Its economy remains the most innovative and powerful, and its military capabilities far exceed anyone else's. Americans worry about China catching up with the US. But although China may be abreast or even ahead in some fields, it will be many years before China can equal the US. And contrary to what some people in China think, the US is not a declining power, nor is it withdrawing from the world. In fact, the US has made clear its intention to compete robustly, though in a different mode than before. Even short of outright conflict, a prolonged period of tension and uncertainty would be extremely damaging. Many serious international problems, like the Korean situation, nuclear non-proliferation, and climate change, cannot be tackled without the full participation of the US and China, together with other countries. In economic terms, the loss will not just be a percentage point or two of GDP, but the huge benefits of globalized markets and production chains, and the sharing of knowledge and breakthroughs that enable all countries to progress faster together. We should therefore do our utmost to avoid going down the path of conflict and causing enmity on both sides that will last for generations. Of course, it's a duty of security and defense establishments to think the unthinkable and plan for worst-case scenarios. But it's the responsibility of political leaders to find solutions to head off these extreme outcomes. And this is hard because both sides have leaders facing powerful domestic pressures. In the US, the political mood is deeply divided and disgruntled. Large segments of American society have lost confidence in globalization and multilateralism. According to a Pew survey last year, nearly half of all Americans have an unfavorable opinion of China. As the presidential elections approach, these attitudes will surely deepen because neither the Republicans nor the Democrats will want to risk being accused of being soft on China. Regardless whether President Trump is re-elected or another Republican or Democrat wins, these sentiments will not go away. China may not have US-style presidential elections, but their leaders face strong internal pressures too. In fact, the orientation of the Chinese leadership is primarily domestic. They know they have major issues to deal with at home. These include unevenly distributed growth, significant rural poverty, an aging population, and rising expectations for a better quality of life. Both sides are sensitive about being perceived weak. Out of political necessity, the US wants to show that it has come out ahead in any deal. On the other side, because of China's long history with the West, its leaders cannot afford to appear to succumb to Western pressure to accept an unequal treaty. Just a few weeks ago, China commemorated the centennial of the May 4th movement. Not all of you may be familiar with it, but it is an important date in modern Chinese history. In 1999, at the Versailles Peace Conference, a feeble China was forced to accept the decisions of the big powers. China was on the winning side, but the settlement went against their interests. This caused Peking University students to demonstrate in protest, launching a nationalist movement to modernize and revive the country. And this was a seminal moment in modern Chinese history. This zero-sum dynamic makes it very hard to construct an agreement that is politically acceptable to both parties. But ultimately, it is in the interests of both the US and China to reach such an accommodation and to persuade their domestic publics to accept it. They both need to keep their relationship steady so that both can focus on their respective pressing domestic priorities and not be distracted by troubled relations with the other. What can other countries do collectively to stem the growing hostility and instability? Small states like Singapore can do little to influence the big powers, but we are not entirely without agency. There are many opportunities for small countries to work together to deepen economic cooperation, strengthen regional integration, and build up multilateral institutions. This way, we can strengthen our influence as a group and advance a collective position on issues that matter to us, be they trade, security, or technology. Our multilateral institutions today are far from perfect. The WTO is one of the major institutions in the post-war global order. But now it's almost paralyzed and urgently needs reform. Multilateral global deals like the Uruguay round are no longer practical when agreement requires a full consensus among 164 member countries of hugely diverse interests and philosophies. Furthermore, the WTO was designed for an agriculture and manufacturing-based world economy, but the world has moved on to services and now increasingly digital and intellectual property, which need much more complicated rules. The US has lost faith in the WTO. It often acts unilaterally, imposing tariffs and trade sanctions outside WTO rules. It prefers negotiating bilateral deals one-on-one against smaller countries in trials of strength. It gives more weight to the US's direct benefits in the disputes at hand than to its broader interests in upholding the multilateral system. And this has caused concern to many of the US's friends and allies. Singapore cannot afford to adopt the same point of view. Being small, we are naturally disadvantaged in bilateral negotiations. We need to reform and strengthen multilateral institutions, not cripple or block them. More fundamentally, confining ourselves to a bilateral approach means foregoing win-win opportunities which come from countries working together with more partners. And we need to build a broader regional and international architecture of cooperation. When groups of countries deepen their economic cooperation, they will enhance not just their shared prosperity, but also their collective security. And with more stake in one another's success, they will have greater incentive to uphold a conducive and peaceful international order, which will benefit many countries, big and small. Thus, short of universal trade agreements, we should at least strive for regional, or as the jargon goes, plurilateral agreements. This may be a second-best solution, but is a practical way to incrementally build support for lower trade barriers and higher standards, which can then be adopted by other countries. This was the rationale behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. The US originally came on board the TPP because it saw the strategic benefits, although it ultimately withdrew. Fortunately, the remaining 11 members were able to preserve nearly all that had been negotiated, and so the comprehensive and progressive agreement for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, is now in force. A few more adjectives, slightly smaller scope, but not bad. I'm glad that more countries have expressed interest to join the CPTPP, including South Korea, Thailand, and the United Kingdom. China is also watching the CPTPP carefully. They are not ready to join now, but I hope that they will seriously consider doing so sometime in the future. Similarly, I hope one day it will become politically possible for a US administration to rethink the US position and recognize that it stands to gain economically and strategically from becoming a member of the partnership that it played such a leading role in designing. Meanwhile, countries in the Asia-Pacific are working on the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, another alphabet soup, RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. It has a different footprint from the CPTPP. It covers all the key countries on the western side of the Pacific, including Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and also importantly, Australia, New Zealand, and India. This inclusive configuration minimizes the risk of the RCEP being misperceived as a bloc that excludes the US and its friends. With such a wide range of participants, the RCEP standards are naturally less ambitious than the CPTPPs, and the deal is also much harder to negotiate. Nonetheless, I hope the participants can take the final step to complete the RCEP by this year, or if not, as soon as the election schedules of the key players allow. Of course, regional cooperation goes beyond trade. In Southeast Asia, ASEAN has provided 10 very different countries an effective platform for dialogue and cooperation. ASEAN has deepened ties and kept the peace among its members. It's become an effective regional partner of other countries and enabled its members to project a stronger external presence as a group. ASEAN works on the basis of consensus. It makes more progress in some areas than others because ASEAN members are not immune to the strategic forces which pull us in different directions. This is the hard reality of cooperation in a region exposed to multiple external influences. Despite its limitations, ASEAN has contributed greatly to the well-being of its members and the security of the region, and ASEAN's partners recognize the value of ASEAN centrality. Amid the geopolitical shifts, new concepts and platforms for regional cooperation have emerged, notably China's Belt and Road Initiative. Singapore supports the Belt and Road Initiative. We see it as a constructive mechanism for China to be positively engaged with the region and beyond. That's why we are active participants. For example, we work with the World Bank to promote financial and infrastructure connectivity, and we provide supporting professional and legal services to BRI countries. We are also partnering China to develop the new International Land-Sea Trade Corridor, which connects Western China to Southeast Asia under the China-Singapore-Chongqing Connectivity Initiative. Of course, the substance of the BRI and the way in which the BRI is implemented are very important. The specific projects must be economically sound and commercially viable and must bring long-term benefits to its partners. This has not always been the case. Some BRI projects have run into significant problems. Overall, the BRI must be open and inclusive and must not turn the region into a closed bloc centered on a single major economy. As Asian countries deepen their links with China, they also need to grow their ties with the US, Europe, Japan, and others. In other words, the BRI should help China to integrate with the world. The end result should be to strengthen globalization and not to divide the world into rival spheres of influence. I believe China appreciates this. At the recent BRI forum in Beijing, Chinese leaders stated clearly that the BRI would be open, green, and clean. China's finance minister set out debt sustainability requirements for Belt and Road projects, which the IMF has welcomed. In the nature of such reassurances, the test will be how these statements of intent are implemented in practice, but these are steps in the right direction. Meanwhile, other initiatives have been proposed for regional cooperation. For example, several countries have proposed various concepts of Indo-Pacific cooperation. These ideas are less fully elaborated or implemented than the BRI, but Singapore's attitude towards them is consistent. We support regional cooperation initiatives which are open and inclusive platforms for countries to cooperate constructively and deepen regional integration. These initiatives should strengthen existing cooperation arrangements centered on ASEAN. They should not undermine them, create rival blocs, deepen fault lines, or force countries to take sides. They should help bring countries together rather than split them apart. US-China relations will define the tenor of international relations for years to come. It's natural that the two powers will vie for power and influence, but competition should not inevitably lead to conflict. We hope the US and China find a constructive way forward, competing certainly, but at the same time cooperating on major issues of mutual interest and global problems. Some people argue that compromise is not possible or perhaps not even desirable because the US and China hold such different values. Indeed, one US official recently defined the clash with China as a fight with a really different civilization and a different ideology. Others observe that the US is a young country that wants everyone to be like them, while China is an old country that believes no one else can be like them. To expect every country to adopt the same cultural values and political system is neither reasonable nor realistic. In fact, humankind's diversity is its strength. There is much we can learn from one another, from the differences in our values, perspectives, systems, and policies. The story of humankind's progress has been one of exchange of ideas and of continuous learning and adaptation. Henry Kissinger said last year that we are in a very, very grave period for the world. No one can predict which way events will develop. At different times in the last 2 centuries, Southeast Asia has seen rivalry between great powers. It has experienced destruction and suffering from war and occupation. It has been divided into opposing camps. It has seen how isolation from the world economy led to stagnation and sometimes conflict. At other times, it has benefited from international cooperation that created an open, stable environment where countries could prosper in peace. On a long view, we cannot rule out any of these eventualities. But in our own generation, we must work together to maximize the chances that countries will have the wisdom and courage to make the right choices, opt for openness and integration, peace and cooperation, and so preserve and expand the progress that we have made together. Thank you very much.
Prime Minister, thank you very much. That was advertised by me as a Masterly survey and it was delivered as a Masterly survey. We are all very grateful. We have time for 2 or 3 questions before we all settle down to enjoy dinner. I would ask anyone who does want to ask a question to raise their hand high and even stand up so that I have a chance of seeing them, and then I will help to direct the microphone towards them. If by any chance anyone is going to ask a question in Mandarin, I think we have the opportunity for an immediate consequential translation. And indeed, the first question, I think, is from General Hu Lei from China. So if he could pose the question.
感谢戚洪亮博士，我是中国人民解放军代表团何兰将军。Thank you very much, Dr. Chipman. I'm Lieutenant General He Lei from Chinese delegation. 我首先祝贺李显龙总理刚才做了一个精彩的主旨演讲，他的许多观点值得点赞。我以前曾经听到这么一句话，说新加坡小国大私欲。通过刚才李总理的主旨演讲，证明了这句话是名副其实的。Congratulations to Prime Minister Lee's excellent keynote speech, and which is highly appreciated. I heard the Singaporeans often say, we are small, but we think big. I think your presentation or your keynote speech is a perfect demonstration of the saying.
刚才李总理在演讲当中讲到最近一个阶段，中美两国存在着一定的问题、矛盾和争端。我提的问题是中美两国 在当前如何能够从维护地区和世界和平的大局出发，能够从和平发展的大趋势出发，妥善解决当前存在的矛盾和问题。第二个问题是前不久我也多次听到李总理讲到，在当前大国关系存在矛盾和问题的时候，主张小国不选边站队。我想在当前这种局势下，如何做到积极作为，避免选边站队？谢谢。
In your keynote speech, you mentioned that there are difficulties and problems between China and between powers. And my question is, how should the powers do to avoid confrontation and conflict, to have a better security environment for development of others, and also in order to maintain peace and stability and prosperity in the region? And also, you mentioned many times that medium and small countries don't want to take sides between powers. So I want to know, what should the small countries to have positive initiatives to avoid taking sides between powers? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, the first question is, how can China and America address the issues from the point of view of the overall big situation and strategic perspective, and deal with the contradictions between them? I think there are two answers to this question. One is, you must be able to engage at the top level and engage openly and candidly to address the basic issue between the two, which is that China is growing and its growth has to be accommodated, and other countries have to adjust, and China has to adjust. And this is the first basic thing which has to be accepted and understood by both sides, and then individual issues can be discussed within that context. It's not easy to do because both sides have got very set narratives as to what the events mean and whether the developments have been well-intentioned or have had some ulterior purpose, or there is some move being made which is planned for some future objectives. But unless this basic premise is debated, at least we agree on this, then you can go forward and you can discuss specific issues. Then when you discuss the specific issues, you have to look at them on their merits and try to resolve them one by one. If you try to deal with trade and you bring in other considerations, that's going to make it very difficult to solve the trade issues. If you look at the trade issues on their own merits, they can be resolved. If you're looking at technology issues, they can be resolved. If you want to deal with cybersecurity, that's harder. But on its own merits, you can discuss what are the things which need to be done in order to establish rules, in order to establish trust, in order to be able to work together rather than always to be at loggerheads. And to deal with each of the issues one by one, and slowly in the process, you get trust. Slowly in the process, we make progress. It's not a magic solution, but I think that you have to think of it top-down and also individually on the issues. As for what small countries can do to actively avoid taking sides, well, we do our best to try to be friends with both and to maintain our relationships with both and develop ties, whether it's economic, whether it's trade, whether it's human resource development, whether it's diplomatic relations, even security exchanges and visits and exercises and commemorations. We maintain links with both sides. But to actively avoid taking sides actually also requires actively not being pressured to take sides. And unfortunately, when the lines start to get drawn, everybody asks, are you my friend or not my friend? And that makes it difficult for the small countries. We must expect sometimes to be asked these questions, and the answer is, well, I'm friends with you, but I have many friends, and that's the way the world has to be. And if it were not, I think it would be a much unhappier world.
Thank you very much. So we'll just take two more. I think Mr. Hsien Loong from the RSIS caught my eye. I just can't remember where he caught my eye from. So can he just
Right at the
stand up? If he, there you are, exactly. So perhaps you could ask the next question. And the final one will be from Mr. Chung-Min Lee, actually Professor Chung-Min Lee of the Republic of Korea here. But Mr. Hsien Loong first, please.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Good evening, Prime Minister Lee. My name is Hsien Loong. I'm from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at the Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore. And I'm also here as a participant of the Southeast Asia Young Leaders Program of this Shangri-La Dialogue. I have a question related to Singapore and 5G. I was actually reading the news about the Nikkei conference in Tokyo yesterday. Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad was asked whether Malaysia would follow the US lead to ban technology from Huawei. And I noted down what his response was. He said, and I quote, "Malaysia is too small to have an effect on a huge company like Huawei, whose research is far bigger than the whole of Malaysia's research capability. So we try to make use of their technology as much as possible. Yes, there may be some spying, but what is there to spy in Malaysia? We are an open book," unquote. So therefore, my questions are, firstly, does Singapore share his view? And secondly, will Singapore be using Huawei for Singapore's 5G network? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, Singapore is even smaller than Malaysia. But we are in the process of defining and selecting our 5G system and the equipment. It may be more than one set, but we haven't decided. We haven't settled either in the network configuration or what the equipment is going to be, who the suppliers are. We're studying this carefully. We're consulting with industry, we're consulting with friendly regulators, and we will make these decisions in due course. But what is at stake in this 5G discussion? And it is to have a secure telecommunications network. Telecom systems are very complex, and especially 5G is an order of magnitude more complex than 4G. And we want a resilient telecom system because it's a backbone of the economy. And we want a secure telecom system because you want to have confidence that it will work for you and it's not leaking on you. But there are many other considerations as well, because you need to look at performance, you need to look at costs, you need to look at reliability, growth potential, vendor diversity. So there are many considerations in choosing a telecom system, including a 5G system. I would also say, from the technical point of view, it's quite unrealistic to expect 100% security from any telecom system you buy. Even the handphone you buy is not 100% secure, much less the entire telephone network. And it doesn't matter whom you buy it from. It can be a friendly country, it can be a hostile country, you can design it yourself. Every system will have vulnerabilities. Some may be innocently there, some may be deliberately there, some may be discovered later, only by chance. But every system will have its vulnerabilities, and they are bound to be discovered and exploited by all kinds of black hats, sooner or later. And this is a fact. And therefore, when we are talking about telecom security, we have to understand it's not 0-1, black-white. You're talking about risks, you're talking about degrees, you're talking about the trade-offs of different systems and vendors, one safer than the other, one less safe, some advantages, some disadvantages. You also have to think, what are you going to use a system for? What are the use cases? For some use cases, it will be very sensitive. My intelligence networks, I absolutely do not want anybody listening in. And then I may need to run a totally dedicated network. I may decide to have somebody carry a bag and with guards to deliver the message because I don't want an online signature. But there will be other networks which will be less sensitive, and then our risk tolerance can be greater. So the technical aspect you have to understand. It's not absolute. It's very important, but it has to be evaluated against other things. But beyond the technical aspect, there's also the question of trust. And that is the more fundamental issue. Because if I don't trust the vendor, then I can inspect his software, I can test his system, I may find no bugs there, and I still cannot be sure. Because there may be no bugs there today, it may be very well hidden or it may not exist, but with every update which comes, something changes, and how do I know where I will stand down the road during the contract? So I need to have trust in order to use the system. And if I suspect that you will abuse my trust to compromise my systems, I will not be able to do business with you. So that is a very serious problem. And I think that is a problem when you are buying a system and you're buying it from another country and you have to take into consideration the state of your relations with that country and not just the technical aspects. Of course, the trouble with this is that when you go down this road, you end up with very grave consequences. Because if I don't trust your system, you are not going to trust my system. And then the chips, and then the software, and then the firmware, and then the whole supply chain. And then you are in your world, I'm in my world. And that is fundamentally a different kind of world from the one which we have been building over the last 30 years, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviets did that. They had their own systems, they had their own aeroplanes, they had their own computers. There were IBM computers in America. The Soviets had something looking remarkably similar. The French and British built the Concorde. The Soviets made their own thing. They call it the Concorde-ski because it looked just like the Concorde, but it was theirs and their supply chain. On one side you had Boeings, and in those days not yet, well, and maybe some Airbus. The Soviets had Ilyushins and their own aeroplanes. Tupolevs. And it's a completely different world. I think it's an unhappier world. It's a less safe world. It's a problem. So I think trust is a very serious problem when you're talking about 5G. And it's a very difficult problem to solve this because on the internet you have anonymity. You can't definitively identify who the bad guys are. Who's the intruder? Do I know who he is? I can suspect. Can I prove who he is? I can't. Therefore, with this cloak of anonymity, the incentive for players, whether state players or non-state players, to behave themselves is considerably diminished. You won't be found out, you can't be caught red-handed. Therefore, what is to stop you, what is to stop me from doing what I want to do, which is really not a good thing? And if you look around the room, everybody denies doing this. And yet if you look around the room, everybody says, I have a very serious problem with cybersecurity, with intrusions. Who are these people? Well, if you study it, they'll say there are multiple actors, and including state-sponsored actors. Which states, which sponsors, don't know, but there are a lot of them there, and none of us have said that we are them. So that's a problem. Then everybody has his own suspicions, everybody acts on his own suspicions, and then even innocent companies, innocent players get caught up. And I can't afford to trust you. I don't know. You can't prove your innocence. I can't prove your guilt. And so in the end, it's what the economists in their rather bland jargon call a market failure. I should do the business. There is an opportunity to trust one another, but it's failed. And so that is where you are with 5G. In the long term, you need to establish rules. We have to find some ways we can pin responsibility, we can name and shame, and then there's some restraint. Okay, I won't do this, you won't do this, because everybody will know if I do it, and it will damage my reputation. But that will take time. For the immediate decisions on the 5G systems, I think each country will have to weigh the options, the uncertainties, and will have to make its own choice.
Thank you very much. Last quick question from Chipman, Republic of Korea, also chairman of the Advisory Council of IISS. Chipman.
Thank you, John. Prime Minister, thank you for this majestic dual design of Asian security. My question to you, sir, is you pointed out the growing dilemma that Asian allies face between the U.S. and China. Among the great things that China has achieved over the last 40 years, is that of the 14 countries surrounding China, not one is a natural enemy. But the deficit is not one is a natural friend. And amongst many Asian states, I believe here in Southeast Asia as well, there is a deep sense of discomfort vis-a-vis China. What would you tell the Chinese leadership today to increase their comfort level vis-a-vis Asian countries, both in Southeast Asia and East Asia, in the years and decades ahead? Thank you.
I think this is, you touch on a sensitive issue, it's a real one. It's a challenge which every big country faces. Because you are big, because you're powerful, what you do has very big consequences on others. How you act is interpreted by others very differently than if you were a small country. As the old Mr. Lee Kuan Yew used to say, when elephants fight, the grass is trampled. When elephants make love, the grass also suffers. And so it's very difficult to be an elephant. And yet the elephant has to get on with smaller countries, because if all the smaller countries decide that this is not in its interest, then you can't do anything about it. But the lack of goodwill, I do not think is conducive towards the long-term sustainability of the power and influence of the great power. I think in an intellectual sense, the Chinese understand this. About 10 years ago, maybe a bit longer, there was a series which was shown in China on television called The Rise of Great Powers, 大国崛起. And it explained, took one by one, very objectively, the great powers in the world, the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the British, the Soviets, the Americans, how they rose, how it was through force in many cases, how there was a pushback, and how eventually things went wrong and the power failed. And the clear conclusion from that is you must emerge peacefully, and you must be able to do so in a way which wins acceptance from the global community. So you may be the superpower, but you have to have legitimacy, you have to have soft power. It's not just force. And so I think in an intellectual sense, China understands that. In a practical sense, it's very difficult to implement, because each one of us, we find it very difficult to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, looking at our own conduct and our own norms and our own expectations, and concluding that we don't look the way we look to ourselves. It's very, very hard. For a big country, it's even harder. So, therefore, I would say if you look at the other countries which have been dominant in Southeast Asia or in Asia, since the war, the U.S. have had a presence in Asia. They are powerful. They have the 7th Fleet. Nobody doubts that they can outdo any other of the countries in the region by spades. But they have been welcomed, and there are many friends which the U.S. has in Asia. It's not that they buy them, but there is a certain breadth of spirit, of generosity, of policy. It is possible in that environment has been possible for the United States friends and for those who are not quite so close to the US but live in the region to grow, prosper, and compete in peace. And I think to be able to do that for 60, 70 years, I mean, from time to time people will put up a sign to say, Yankee, go home. But they don't seriously mean that. If Yankee went home, they'd be very sorry. So it's quite hard to ask one big country to choose another big country as a role model. But I think there's something to be learned from the US experience in Asia since the war.
Prime Minister, thank you very much. Let me close this. Prime Minister, let me close this by observing that no one could argue that you have avoided a tough question or failed to honor it with a thoughtful reply. I noted that the very first time that you gave a keynote address to the Shangri-La Dialogue was in 2006, and the second time was 2015. 9 years separated those two speeches. 4 years have separated your last speech from this one. I think it's probably true that there has been double the amount of strategic change in the last 4 years than in the previous 9, and therefore this audience really wanted to hear your analysis of that change and how to cope with it. For that, we thank you deeply for your support to the IISS, for the Shangri-La Dialogue process, and for the goals that we have set ourselves for serious dialogue here that you have so effortlessly and fluently championed. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
We might, we'll go down this way.